like a what if. So what if we were going to pull out of the UN? And what if we were going to say you can't be in New York anymore, right? And then Beijing comes in and says, we got a building for you, okay, beautiful building, okay, you can come here. And now the UN is in Beijing. And all the countries around the world now don't come to New York anymore. They go to Beijing.
Welcome back to Freedom Forge. If you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications because we cover the political stories and Senate hearings the mainstream media either ignores or twists beyond recognition. Today, we're reacting to a heated congressional hearing focused on the United Nations, America's role inside the UN, and whether the United States should continue funding organizations that many Americans believe no longer represent our interests or our values. The discussion touched on Hamas, Iran's influence inside international institutions, China's growing global power, and whether the UN has become too bloated and too corrupt to reform. And honestly, this hearing exposed exactly why so many conservatives and patriotic Americans are fed up with globalist institutions.
I ask unanimous consent that my letter of September 23, 2025, calling on the Secretary General to designate Hamas as a terrorist organization be placed in the record. And additionally, his response more than a month later, talking about the need for peace and a permanent ceasefire, but not responsive to my letter.
Without objection.
Thank the gentleman.
With that, I'll turn it over to Ranking Member Mr. Moskowitz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gennarini, did I say that right? Yes. Okay. I saw your graph, right? I would be interested to see the graph and overlaying that with the U.S. budget. Obviously, the spending at the UN goes up, but I'm just also curious if that's just not an outlier, that our spending has gone up in the U.S. budget in the same way, and if that's just caught up in it. I'm just curious if you've looked at that.
Yeah, U.S. funding for the UN has increased in more or less at the same rate as from other donors to the UN system. In fact, it's generally fairly coordinated, voluntary contributions in terms of how member states sort of divvy up their spheres of influence at the UN.
Okay. Mr. Yao, you mentioned, obviously, that no one from the UN appointed Iran to that, and then it was donor states. But did anyone from the UN come out and criticize their appointment? I'm just curious.
The job of UN officials is to work with all 193 member states.
But nobody has like an opinion?
They may have opinions. Their job is to make sure that these convenings of global states to discuss important non-proliferation matters.
I mean, the secretary seems to have a lot of opinions about what happens in the Middle East.
Right.
He's commented on that a lot of times, but
indeed,
between the Israel and Hamas war. But
yeah, I agree. He's repeatedly, as you know, denounced the Hamas attacks on Israel. Repeatedly met with the families of the hostages when they're.
I mean, it's not really a hard statement. Like, he could come out and say, look, obviously it wasn't his pick, but maybe they're not like the best country to be on that panel.
I hear you. I hear you.
Okay, so I understand they didn't pick, but they maybe have an obligation to weigh in. I want to do just because I am curious about this. Is it Mr. Kantorovich?
Yeah.
Okay. So, because I'm curious about this, I want to just run like a what if. So what if we were going to pull out of the UN? And what if we were going to say you can't be in New York anymore, right? And then Beijing comes in and says, we got a building for you, okay, beautiful building, okay, you can come here. And now the UN is in Beijing. And all the countries around the world now don't come to New York anymore. They go to Beijing. And, they're funding 70% of the UN. Because I think there's bipartisan agreement that there are major issues. I think where there's some disagreement is, do you use the budget to try to reform it, right? Do you use the threat of support to try to reform it, or do you leave? And the do you leave situation for me, I just don't see how that gets better. So I just wanted to discuss that.
Could I address the hypothetical?
Yeah, please.
So I don't think leaving is within the political horizon, which is why I don't address it. But I think it is worth looking at what would happen, because the argument but China's going to take over, or China will sort of eat our cake if we pull back, is one of the major arguments against U.S. pullback at the United Nations. But I think it's worth saying that the United Nations without the United States is not the same United Nations. It is not the same prize for China to take over. With the United States in, it makes sense for China to try to assert influence because it has vastly more credibility. Without the United Nations, not just in budgetary terms, 25%, right? It's in theory, a fundamentally different organization. I don't think anyone wants to be in Beijing as much as they want to be in New York, and parking would certainly be much better. So I wouldn't catastrophize it. There would be definitely drawbacks, but what I think is catastrophic is ruling that out as an option from the beginning, because it makes it a too big to fail lock-in situation.
Well, but actually a great point, right? Is the UN too big to fail, right? I mean, that's a good question, which, you know, I understand maybe from a negotiation standpoint, you don't want to take any option off the table. I'm fine with that. But really, reform seems to be the main option, the best of all options, rather than like what we did with the WHO.
Which is less than quitting the United Nations, right? That's a kind of scaled down version.
Okay. I don't have anything else. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you so much. At this time, we'll
Right from the beginning, you could hear frustration building over the United Nations refusing to directly respond to concerns about Hamas. One lawmaker referenced a letter calling on the UN Secretary General to officially designate Hamas as a terrorist organization, and instead of getting a direct answer, the response was basically the same vague diplomatic language we always hear: peace, ceasefire, dialogue. That's the problem right there. Most Americans don't need a committee meeting or a diplomatic seminar to figure out whether Hamas is a terrorist organization. Hamas murdered civilians. Hamas attacked innocent people. Hamas openly celebrates violence. Yet somehow the international elite always finds a way to dance around clear moral questions because they're terrified of offending the wrong political bloc inside the UN. And this is why trust in these organizations keeps collapsing. One of the most revealing moments came when they discussed Iran being placed on international panels connected to non-proliferation and global governance. Think about how absurd that sounds to everyday Americans. Iran, a regime constantly accused of funding terror groups and destabilizing the Middle East, being elevated into positions of influence inside global institutions. That alone tells you how upside down the priorities have become. Now, to be fair, one witness pointed out that UN officials themselves didn't directly appoint Iran, saying member states made that decision. But let's be honest here. If your organization constantly allows bad actors to gain legitimacy, eventually you stop being a neutral institution and start becoming part of the problem. And that's where conservatives have a serious issue with the United Nations. The American taxpayer funds an enormous portion of these organizations. We send billions overseas while many Americans struggle with inflation, high gas prices, border chaos, and economic uncertainty at home. Yet every year Washington elites tell us we must keep paying, because if we don't, somehow the world order will collapse. That argument was challenged directly during this hearing, and I thought that was one of the strongest moments. One congressman basically asked a hypothetical question: what happens if America pulls out of the UN? What happens if the headquarters leaves New York and China steps in to host it in Beijing? Now the establishment answer is always fear. Fear that China will dominate. Fear that America will lose influence. Fear that the international system will collapse without unlimited American money propping it up. But one witness actually made an interesting point. He argued that without the United States, the UN would fundamentally lose much of its legitimacy and influence. In other words, America is the prize. America is the reason the institution matters globally in the first place. And that's true. The reason China wants influence in these organizations is because America built the modern international system after World War II. American power, American money, American military strength, and American economic leadership made these institutions relevant. Without the United States, they become something very different. Now, personally, as someone who believes in strong American sovereignty, I think this hearing exposed a deeper issue that many people in Washington still refuse to confront. The United Nations was originally sold as a place for cooperation and diplomacy. Fine. Most Americans support peace and cooperation. But over time, these organizations drifted further and further away from representing ordinary citizens and closer toward representing unelected global bureaucrats. That's what frustrates conservatives. Americans vote for Congress. Americans vote for presidents. But we don't vote for UN officials making statements about our foreign policy, climate rules, energy standards, speech regulations, or immigration frameworks. Yet somehow these institutions increasingly act like they should influence domestic politics around the world. And Americans are tired of being lectured by countries that depend on our military protection while criticizing us at every opportunity. Another important part of this hearing was the discussion about whether the UN has become too big to fail. That phrase should ring alarm bells for every taxpayer because we've heard it before. Banks are supposedly too big to fail. Government programs are supposedly too big to fail. Bureaucracies are supposedly too big to fail. And somehow ordinary Americans are always the ones forced to keep paying the bill. What I appreciated in this hearing is that some lawmakers at least acknowledged reform is necessary. Even the more moderate voices admitted the UN has major structural problems. The disagreement is really about strategy. Do you threaten funding cuts to force reform? Do you reduce America's role gradually? Or do you completely walk away? Now my opinion as a right-leaning patriot is this. America should never surrender its sovereignty to international organizations. Ever. That doesn't mean isolationism. It doesn't mean abandoning diplomacy. It doesn't mean refusing alliances. But it does mean America's interests come first. If an international institution consistently undermines American interests, protects hostile regimes, or excuses terrorism, then we absolutely should reconsider how much money and legitimacy we give it. And here's another thing the mainstream media won't say. Ordinary Americans notice the double standards. When democracies defend themselves, global institutions suddenly become obsessed with investigations, condemnations, and resolutions. But when terrorist organizations commit atrocities or authoritarian regimes abuse human rights, the response becomes softer, slower, and full of diplomatic loopholes. People notice that hypocrisy. The hearing also touched on the World Health Organization and America's previous pullback from it. Again, this is part of a larger debate happening worldwide right now. More citizens are questioning whether global institutions actually serve the people or whether they mainly serve political elites, lobbyists, and bureaucratic insiders. And I think that skepticism is healthy. Healthy skepticism is not extremism. Wanting accountability for taxpayer dollars is not radical. Wanting American sovereignty protected is not dangerous. In fact, that's exactly what elected officials are supposed to do. Now, do I think America should immediately abandon every international institution tomorrow morning? No. Serious foreign policy requires strategy, leverage, and realism. But I do think conservatives are right to pressure these organizations and demand reform, because the current trajectory is unsustainable. The American people cannot be expected to endlessly fund institutions that often appear openly hostile to American values, while simultaneously excusing some of the worst actors on the global stage. And that's why this hearing mattered. It wasn't just about the UN. It was about a much bigger question. Who governs America? American voters or international elites? That's the real fight underneath all of this. At the end of the day, I think most patriotic Americans want the same basic things. They want a strong America. They want secure borders. They want peace through strength. They want allies to pull their weight. And they want their government focused more on struggling American families than on protecting massive international bureaucracies from criticism. This hearing exposed just how divided Washington still is on those questions. But one thing is becoming clear. The days of Americans blindly trusting global institutions without accountability are over. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you like this video, subscribe to Freedom Forge, and let me know in the comments. Should America reform the United Nations, reduce funding, or completely walk away from it altogether? I want to hear your thoughts.